15 years ago, at a family barbecue, my older brother pulled me aside, beer in hand, and told me plainly that what I was doing was disgusting. He didn't whisper it. He said it loud enough that two cousins nearby stopped their own conversation to listen. I was 56. Melinda was 29. We'd been dating for 8 months, and I'd just told my extended family, gathered for my mother's 75th birthday, that I intended to marry her. 15 years later, Melinda and I have been married for 14 of those years, raised 2 children together, and last month welcomed our 3rd grandchild. Yes, grandchild, because our oldest daughter, now 13, has an older half-sister from Melinda's first marriage who had her own first baby this spring. I want to tell you what actually happened in the 15 years between that barbecue and this grandchild, because the word my brother used that day turned out to describe something entirely different than what our life actually became. I need to give you some background, because I think the age gap makes more sense once you understand the specific shape of the life that preceded it. I spent 28 years as an airline mechanic, a demanding physical career that left me divorced by 48, my first wife tired, understandably, of a schedule that kept me away for stretches that strained a marriage neither of us had fully anticipated when we started it in our 20s. We had no children together, a fact that became its own quiet grief as the years passed, and neither of us remarried quickly enough to change that outcome. I spent the following 8 years largely alone, focused on work, occasionally dating without much seriousness, gradually settling into a version of bachelor life I told myself was contentment, but which, looking back honestly, was closer to resignation. I was 56, recently retired early, due to a shoulder injury that ended my mechanic career sooner than planned, when I met Melinda. We met at a community college continuing education class, of all places, a basic Spanish course I'd enrolled in partly out of boredom during my early retirement, partly because I'd always regretted never learning a second language during my working years. Melinda was there for entirely practical reasons, brushing up on Spanish for a promotion at the accounting firm where she worked. She was 29, recently divorced herself, raising a 4-year-old daughter, Sophia, largely on her own, after a marriage that had ended badly enough that she'd moved back to her hometown specifically to have her own parents' support nearby. We were partnered together for a conversation exercise in our 3rd-class session, and I remember, specifically, being struck less by anything romantic in that first exchange, and more by how genuinely funny she was. A dry, quick wit that caught me entirely off guard from someone I'd initially assumed, based on nothing but her age, might not have much in common with a 56-year-old former mechanic. I want to be honest that I resisted the growing attraction for several weeks after that first class, aware even then of how the age difference might appear to outside observers, and genuinely uncertain whether pursuing it would be fair to her, given the additional complexity of Sophia's presence in her life. It was Melinda, actually, who first suggested coffee after class, direct in a way I found refreshing, after years of more hesitant dating experiences in my late 50s. We dated for several months before either of us mentioned it to our families, both of us aware, I think, of the reaction the age gap might provoke, and both of us wanting to be certain of our own feelings before inviting outside judgment into something still forming. The whispers started before we made anything official. A mutual acquaintance from the community college mentioned to my sister that she'd seen me with a young woman, phrased in a tone that apparently carried more insinuation than the plain facts warranted. By the time I actually told my family directly, several of them had already formed opinions based on second-hand rumor rather than any actual conversation with either Melinda or me. Melinda felt the judgment too, in her own way, perhaps more acutely than I did. Her own mother, initially, worried aloud that I was some version of predatory, drawn to her specifically because of Sophia's presence, a suspicion that stung considerably, given how genuinely Melinda knew our relationship had actually developed. I remember a specific dinner at Melinda's parents' house, early in our relationship, where her father asked me directly, in front of the whole table, what my intentions were toward his daughter, a question phrased with a wariness that made clear he'd already formed assumptions about a man 27 years older pursuing his daughter. I answered as honestly as I could, describing what I actually felt, rather than offering reassurances designed simply to ease his suspicion. And I watched, over the following months, his skepticism gradually soften as he observed the relationship directly, rather than through the lens of his initial assumptions. I want to describe that barbecue specifically, because I think the details matter more than the general summary. It was my mother's 75th birthday. Nearly the entire extended family gathered in my sister's backyard. I'd brought Melinda for the first time, introduced her simply as someone I was seeing, not yet using words like girlfriend, or announcing any specific intentions, wanting the introduction itself to happen gently before any bigger conversation. My brother, Gerald, had clearly been drinking more than usual, and pulled me aside near the drink cooler about an hour into the gathering. "Douglas," he said, loud enough that it wasn't really a private conversation, despite his posture suggesting otherwise. "This is disgusting. She's younger than our niece. What exactly do you think you're doing?" I remember the specific silence that followed, several relatives nearby suddenly finding urgent reasons to examine their plates rather than meet my eyes. Melinda, standing close enough to hear clearly, went quiet in a way I recognized even in those early months as her specific way of absorbing a wound without immediately reacting to it. We left shortly after, earlier than planned, and drove home in a silence that felt heavier than the 20-minute distance between my sister's house and our apartment should have taken. Melinda finally spoke about 10 minutes in, asking quietly whether I thought Gerald spoke for the rest of my family too, or whether his comment had simply been alcohol-fueled bluntness that others privately disagreed with, but hadn't corrected in the moment. I didn't have a confident answer for her that night, which I think worried both of us more than a clearer, more reassuring response would have. The months following that barbecue were genuinely difficult, testing the relationship in ways neither of us had anticipated needing to navigate this early. My mother, to her credit, never used language as harsh as Gerald's, but her own discomfort was evident in smaller ways. A hesitation before including Melinda in family plans, questions phrased in a way that suggested she was still processing, rather than accepting. My sister was more direct in her support, though even she admitted honestly that the age gap had initially concerned her too, before actually spending time with us as a couple. Melinda and I had a serious conversation during this period about whether the relationship was worth the ongoing family strain. I remember her asking me directly whether I was certain enough about us to weather sustained disapproval from people I'd known my entire life. A fair question, given how raw that barbecue had left both of us. I told her I was certain, and I meant it, though I understood even as I said it that certainty alone wouldn't make the following months easy. There was a specific night, about 6 weeks after the barbecue, when Melinda suggested, gently but seriously, that perhaps we should slow things down, giving both families more time to adjust before either of us made any further commitment. I understood the offer as genuine care rather than any weakening of her own feelings, but it frightened me nonetheless, the possibility that Gerald's single comment might succeed in doing exactly what he'd presumably intended, even indirectly. I asked her, instead, to consider moving forward faster rather than slower, reasoning that ongoing uncertainty seemed to be feeding the family tension more than resolving it. She agreed, cautiously, and we became engaged 4 months later. We married a year and a half after that barbecue, a modest ceremony that revealed, plainly, exactly where each family member actually stood. My mother attended, her support having grown genuine by then through the accumulated evidence of watching Melinda interact with Sophia, with me, with the rest of the family across those 18 months. My sister stood as one of my witnesses. Gerald did not attend, sending a brief, formal card instead that neither apologized for the barbecue nor acknowledged it, simply offering generic congratulations that felt, to both Melinda and me, more like an obligation fulfilled than genuine well-wishes. I won't pretend Gerald's absence didn't hurt. He was my only brother, and I'd hoped, naively perhaps, that actually seeing us married might have shifted something in him the way it had gradually shifted my mother. It didn't, not yet, and we settled into married life carrying that specific, unresolved family wound alongside considerable happiness in the marriage itself. I remember scanning the small crowd during the ceremony itself, an old habit I couldn't quite suppress, noting Gerald's absence in a way that briefly pulled my attention from a day that otherwise held nothing but genuine happiness. Melinda noticed, squeezed my hand during our vows exactly at that moment, a small gesture that told me she'd noticed my distraction and understood exactly its source without either of us needing to discuss it explicitly during the ceremony itself. I want to talk about Sophia specifically, because I think raising her together from age 5 onward shaped our marriage as significantly as any romantic milestone did. I never tried to replace her biological father, who remained present but inconsistent in her life throughout her childhood. I aimed instead for something more modest and, I think, more sustainable. A steady, reliable presence she could count on, showing up for school events, teaching her to ride a bike in the driveway of our first shared apartment, being the parent who consistently followed through on commitments in a way her own father apparently struggled to manage. Sophia, now 19 and in her second year of college, has told me more than once that I'm simply dad in every sense that matters to her, biology notwithstanding. That relationship, built patiently across 14 years, is one of the specific, ordinary miracles this age-gapped marriage produced that Gerald's single word at that barbecue never accounted for. I remember a specific moment during her 16th birthday, a difficult year filled with ordinary teenage turbulence, when she came to me rather than Melinda with a problem at school, explaining afterward that she'd wanted a perspective that felt calmer, less emotionally entangled than her mother's understandably protective instinct, that she trusted me with something that vulnerable, unprompted by any biological obligation, remains one of the moments I return to whenever I think about what Gerald's original judgment failed entirely to anticipate. Melinda and I had 2 children together in the years following our wedding, a son, now 12, and a daughter, now 9, both of whom grew up with Sophia as their older sister in every meaningful sense. The age gap between the siblings simply an ordinary family fact rather than any complicated distinction. I want to mention, honestly, that becoming a father again at 59, when our son was born, came with its own physical realities I hadn't fully anticipated. Considerably less energy than I'd had for my working years, a body that recovered from sleepless newborn stretches more slowly than it once would have. But the joy of it, genuinely unexpected joy, after 8 years believing I might never have biological children at all, outweighed every physical complaint by a wide margin. Melinda managed the bulk of the physically demanding early parenting years with remarkable grace, and I compensated where I could, focusing on the specific value an older, more patient father could offer. Endless bedtime stories, unhurried weekend mornings, a kind of steady presence that I think, honestly, benefited from my own accumulated life experience in ways a younger father might not have offered as naturally. I also want to mention a specific fear I carried privately during those early parenting years, one I didn't fully voice to Melinda until much later, a worry about how many years I might realistically have to actually watch these children grow into adulthood, given the age gap between us. That fear surfaces occasionally still, honestly, particularly around milestones like this spring's grandchild, a quiet awareness that Melinda will likely have decades of grandparenting ahead of her that I may not fully share. I've made peace with that reality as much as anyone reasonably can, focused instead on being as fully present as possible for whatever years I do have. I want to tell you what happened with Gerald, because I think the resolution, when it eventually came, matters as much as the original wound. Gerald and I remained distant for nearly 6 years after that barbecue, present at the same larger family gatherings but never genuinely reconciled, a specific, persistent ache underneath otherwise ordinary family life. He met our son once, briefly, at a holiday gathering, polite but clearly still uncomfortable with the entire situation underlying my family. The shift came, unexpectedly, when Gerald's own marriage began struggling seriously around his 58th birthday, a difficult period that apparently forced him to reckon with assumptions he'd held rigidly for years about what marriage was supposed to look like. He called me, out of nowhere, about 7 years after the barbecue, and asked, somewhat awkwardly, whether he could visit and actually get to know Melinda and the kids properly, admitting, without excessive drama, that he'd judged something he'd never actually taken the time to understand. That visit was genuinely awkward at first, the specific discomfort of two brothers trying to bridge 7 years of distance in a single afternoon. Melinda, to her considerable credit, welcomed him warmly despite everything, choosing generosity over the resentment she would have been entirely justified in holding on to. Something shifted over the course of that visit, watching Gerald interact with our children, watching him ask Melinda genuine questions about her life, her work, her own experience of the past 7 years, rather than the dismissive assumptions that had defined his single comment at that long-ago barbecue. He pulled me aside before leaving that day, near the same kind of drink-cooler setting where the original wound had happened years earlier, and said, quietly this time, "Douglas, I was wrong. I judged something I never bothered to actually look at closely. I'm sorry it took me this long to say that. I told him I appreciated it, and I meant it, though I also understood that 7 years of distance don't fully repair in a single afternoon's apology." I asked him, later that same evening after the kids had gone to bed, what had actually changed his mind after so many years of silence. He was quiet for a while before answering, then admitted that watching his own 30-year marriage nearly collapse had forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth, that he'd spent years judging the health of my marriage based purely on a number, the age gap itself, while his own marriage, conventional by every surface measure, had been quietly failing on the actual substance that determines whether a partnership works: communication, mutual respect, genuine effort sustained over years. "I judged your marriage's cover," he said, "while my own book was falling apart on the inside. That's a hard thing to sit with, Douglas. Gerald and I have rebuilt a genuine relationship over the following 8 years, slower than I might have once hoped, but steadier, I think, for having been rebuilt deliberately rather than simply assumed back into place. He's become, unexpectedly, one of our children's favorite uncles, a specific irony neither of us has ever directly discussed, but which sits, quietly, as its own form of ongoing amends. He was present, this spring, for the birth of our first grandchild, Sophia's daughter, holding the baby with a specific tenderness that told me, more than any words could, how completely his original judgment had eventually dissolved. I want to describe our current family shape, 15 years after that barbecue, because I think it directly answers whatever concern Gerald's original comment was actually rooted in. Sophia, now 19, had her daughter this spring, making Melinda and me grandparents at 44 and 71 respectively, an unusual age gap between grandparents that mirrors, in its own way, the original gap between Melinda and me. Our own son and daughter, 12 and 9, are enthusiastic, involved aunt and uncle to their niece, despite being younger than her mother by only 7 years, a family structure that would confuse an outside observer trying to map it onto conventional expectations, but which functions, within our actual family, with complete natural ease. We also, through Melinda's brother's family, gained 2 more grandnieces this same year that our children have started, affectionately, calling grandchildren too, a small linguistic looseness that captures something true about how thoroughly our unconventional family structure has simply become, over 15 years, an ordinary, functioning family rather than anything requiring explanation or defense. If your own family has used a word like Gerald's, disgusting, or something similarly harsh, about a relationship you know, in your own heart, to be genuine, I want to tell you what 15 years taught me. Their judgment isn't necessarily permanent, even when it feels absolute in the moment it's delivered. Gerald's comment felt, at that barbecue, like a door closing permanently on our relationship. It took 7 years, but that door reopened, not through argument or confrontation, but through the accumulated, ordinary evidence of an actual life lived well and honestly in front of him. I don't think you owe anyone a defense of a relationship you know to be genuine. I think you owe yourself the patience to let time and lived evidence do the work that no single argument, however well-reasoned, ever fully accomplishes with someone operating from assumption rather than actual knowledge of your specific relationship. I'd also say this, specifically, to anyone whose own family member might be the one holding on to that judgment right now. Consider whether your certainty is actually built on genuine knowledge of the specific couple in front of you, or on a general pattern you've absorbed from stories that may have nothing to do with the actual relationship you're witnessing. Gerald judged us based on a category, an assumption about what a relationship with our specific age gap must inevitably become. It took him 7 years and his own marital crisis to understand that categories don't actually predict individual outcomes, and I think that lesson applies well beyond just age-gapped relationships. I think about that barbecue often. Still, 15 years later, not with the sting it once carried, but with a kind of quiet amusement at how completely wrong Gerald's single word turned out to describe what actually followed it. Disgusting. That's the word he used, watching a 56-year-old man fall in love with a 29-year-old woman he'd known for 8 months. 15 years later, that same word sits beside a marriage, 2 children, a stepdaughter who calls me dad without hesitation, a reconciled brother who held our first grandchild this spring with visible tenderness, and a family structure so thoroughly, ordinarily functional that explaining the original age gap to new acquaintances has become, honestly, more of a mildly interesting fact than any kind of defining tension. If your own family has used harsh words about a relationship you believe in, I hope you find your own version of this outcome. Not necessarily reconciliation with every person who judged you, but the accumulated, ordinary proof of a life built well enough that the original judgment simply stops mattering as much as it once did. 15 years is a long time to carry a single word from a backyard barbecue. I'm grateful, now, that neither Melinda nor I let it define what came after it. I'll see you in the next one.